we would like to welcome our residential landscapes and the land development process panel to the stage. Dr. Pierce Jones is director and founding member of the Program for Resource Efficient Communities at the University of Florida, where he administers the coordination, development, and delivery of educational programs on best management practices in the built environment. Dr. Richard Levy is the Senior Advisor for Tavistock Development. Richard is a senior executive with extensive experience in land development, economic development, master planning, and real estate investment strategy. Greg Witherspoon is a principal at Canaan Associates, an urban planning, landscape architecture, and architectural design firm based in Orlando. For over 25 years, Mr. Witherspoon is focused on creating sustainable communities through the practice of community planning, landscape architecture, and creative placemaking. Chris Wren is the director of forward planning for Pulte Group. He has worked as both a consultant and developer on numerous large master planned communities, including Viera, Lake Nona, Waterley, Kindred, Everby, and The Grow, as well as mixed-use infill developments including the Sevens in downtown Orlando. Matt McDermott is the landscape manager for Tavistock Development Company, where he is responsible for oversight of the landscape installation and maintenance for the company's two largest projects, the master plan communities of Lake Nona and Sunbridge. Matt is leading a team to develop landscape standards for Sunbridge that upload the community's commitment to water and ecological conservation.
So thank you all again for being here. This is the third year that the outside group has put on this type of meeting. This is the first time that we've done this technical workshop on the front of the outside meeting. There are, in addition to myself, Richard Levy, Greg Witherspoon, Matt McDermott, and Chris Wren will be presenting today about the process of how landscaping decisions are made as developments are planned and implemented. And I'm going to give you, thanks to Richard Levy, he referred to my contribution as the academic perspective. In a lot of circles, that's kind of a negative, don't you think? An academic perspective, that's like not a serious perspective. That's, pie in the sky, cloud thinking, it's not realistic. But anyway, that's what I'm supposed to do, is tell you the not realistic stuff. So the development practice, you all have lived in Florida or been in Florida long enough to have seen what the development process looks like. I've used this set of slides many, many times, and people don't seem to get tired of them. Up in the upper left, the first thing you notice, this is after the fluorescent signs have come down. You notice that some material's been pushed up in a pile, and later there might be a fire in that area, and then all of a sudden there's this clearing and this very large-scale equipment. You're seeing a contour grading of a site, and that's all for stormwater purposes, and when it's done, you end up with stormwater areas, which is actually fill to build up the areas that are below the 100-year floodplain, where you put your roads. And you connect the two with stormwater drains. You can see right there, that connects the roadways to the areas that you dredged out to hold the water, right? Brian, you're going to correct me if I'm making any mistakes here, right? Okay. And the only areas that are actually preserved generally are those wetland areas. Those are the areas that must be preserved, but sites are generally completely cleared. And soil is completely disrupted throughout the site. Once that part is done, you have basic infrastructure installed, roadways, sidewalks, sewer and water, communications sometimes. And then the lots are sold to Chris Wren and his company, Pulte, and they then bring in more fill, and you can tell just how nutritious the soil is that they bring in. They don't want any organic matter in that material. They want that to be clean, and of course, the deeper you dig, the less organic matter, so a lot of times it's coming from deep down. That material is brought in, makes the house at elevation where you need elevation to be. Water flows to the streets. When he is finished building the house, one of the very last things that he would do is put in a landscape. This is not a Pulte home that I'm showing, so I don't want any accusations, but that has been conventional practice, that has conventionally been the cheapest, least expensive way for us to finish a home off. And nobody doesn't really like a watered-in, green turf landscape. We all love it. You can't not love it. But after that is installed on top of that soil that has no nutrition, you effectively have a hydroponic system, which is utilizing our water resources prodigiously, and you also have no nutrition in that material, so you have to add fertilizers, and then there are the herbicides, and there's the mowing and everything else. So that's all conventional practice, what has led us to these landscapes. And so what are some of the conventional practices then that become standard in these neighborhoods? Well, I just picked 4. A few years ago, I was thinking about this, and I said, well, they're going to have to be mowed, and they're going to be fertilized, and there are going to be some herbicide issues, most likely, not necessarily herbicide, pesticide, I should say, and then there's irrigation. How do you compare these in terms of their impact? It's kind of hard. Very different kinds of, well, one way you can do it is by looking at the carbon, the CO2, tied up in the entire process of mowing. And that's easy to understand. Imagine a gallon of gasoline and you combust that, so you generate CO2. So if you think about a carbon footprint of mowing, pretty easy to understand that one. Fertilizer, if you just think about nitrogen made from methane, it's an energy process. A lot of energy is tied up in making ammonia nitrate. And herbicides, a little bit in the active ingredients of energy, and then water. Pump it, move it around, clean it up if it's recycled water. So there's a lot of energy tied up in that. So if you think about it in those terms, then we used, as if you were using, following the IFAS, the University of Florida IFAS recommended rates of mowing, of fertilizer applications. Herbicides, there's no particular recommendation, and then irrigation. So we're following IFAS recommendations. This is what the University of Florida recommends in a turf portion of your landscape, high volume irrigation. You can see that mowing is 15 pounds of CO2 equivalent per 1,000 square feet of yard per year. Fertilizers, 29 pounds CO2 per 1,000 square feet of yard. Pesticides is almost negligible in terms of the carbon footprint of the herbicides and the pesticides. Irrigation, and this is, please pay attention, this is groundwater. This is, you put the well in and you pull it out of the Florida aquifer and you put it on the lawn. That's the least expensive water we have. And 34, pretty interesting, that's the highest energy input, is irrigating the lawns. So as we use up our Florida and aquifer resources, we're going to go to desal or other water projects, after we use reclaimed up. So if you go to Tampa Bay and look at the desal plant and how much it costs to generate that water, look what happened. It just blows the others out of the water, so to speak, right? So this is not a joke. It's an energy issue as well as a water resource issue. We cannot depend on desal as a save-all. So I'm talking from the academic perspective, right? These are fair comments from an academic perspective. And if I were a practical person, I probably wouldn't go that far. But I'm not. I'm an academic. Nick Taylor is an academic. Nick Taylor is part of the H2O SAVE program. He runs that group. And they get water data for us from utilities all over the state of Florida. Now, this happens to be data from Gainesville, Florida, from GRU, Gainesville Regional Utilities. And those bars are homes that were built in 1950, 55, 60, all the way up to 2020. So that's the year the home was built. And that bar represents how much water, what the average daily water consumption is of homes built in those years. That's pretty interesting right there, 1995. What happens? Well, it happens that the property appraiser in Alachua County also keeps records on installed irrigation systems. A lot of counties don't, but we have that data for Alachua County. And you can see the correlation, and by 2020, we're getting close to 90% of homes that are newly installed, newly built, having installed irrigation system, which goes right along with that disturbed earth, a picture that I showed you earlier. This is looking at Osceola and Orange County at the water utilities here. You can see the pattern is pretty much the same. So, academic perspective. We keep doing that, you can expect new homes. Every new home is going to use a lot more water than they used to. Here's a second fairly recent study. This is from September 2022. Data based on the Lake Watch program, which has been in existence through University of Florida IFAS for many, many years, 30 years. We have data on water quality in lakes. And young scientist at UF, Sam Schmidt, who's going to be here tomorrow, he authored this study along with several other UF IFAS faculty. They went into the watersheds, lakes in jurisdictions that had implemented the summertime fertilizer ban and the winter fertilizer ban. Those are two policies that some jurisdictions have implemented. And what they found was where that ban was put in place, you had improved water quality. Doesn't say any more than that. And remember, what is it, Basil? Correlation is not causation, is that right? So I'm not making any big claims here, but I am saying that if you keep putting chemicals on the ground in a watershed, some of those chemicals are going to find their way into your lakes. That's the premise, that's the academic premise. But we need to do more studies on this, so any of you all know people with money to pay for our studies, please see me later. Finally, I keep seeing these stories about insect populations. It's the monarch butterfly, it was the fireflies, bats, birds. This morning it was sea lion pups that you can't read a news feed without some population of wildlife that's being detrimentally impacted. And the one at the Florida Natural History Museum that they talk about inside the insect effect. And it's all about the decline of insects. And Leslie earlier referenced this. If you go to that site and you see what do they recommend you as a homeowner might do to help with that issue, it says reducing pesticide and fertilizer use. It says choosing native plants. It says selecting 5 or 6 flowering plant species known to attract insects and grouping like with like, and grouping flowering species together to create a massive color billboard for insects. So this is a different kind of paradigm that you might want the landscape architects to have in designing for and helping the insect populations in our state. So if I were to summarize what I would be looking for as an academic, my recommendations on landscaping, I would say minimize, eliminate irrigation beyond establishment in new communities. And I would say minimize, eliminate mineral fertilizer use. And I would say minimize, eliminate pesticides. And I would say promote, maximize ecological diversity. So if I were to give you 4 simple guidelines, that's what they would be. Fortunately, I'm asking you basically to move away from this, which these are brand new homes. You can see this is new homes being built right there. You'll be driving right past these new homes. I mean, this is just not lovely. So aside from the not lovely part, that is a desert from the point of view of many insect species and songbirds and bats. So why not more of this? This is what's happening in the villages. Individual homeowners who had the other, but were gardeners, got interested. They actually went through the steps and were allowed to change their landscapes to this. So I guess what we're asking and what I'm hoping will happen is that working with developers very early in the process, that we might begin to bend this curve toward meeting those principles that I identified. And so from an academic perspective, that's what I say. Now, the most real-world guy I know, and a fabulous tennis player, better than me, in fact, which is a lot, is Richard Levy. And he's going to take over now and tell you some realistic stuff.
Great job, thank you. Great job, Pierce. You know, your description of the conventional development process, I think you got a gig after academia. I think a construction development manager on our team, you do very well. Thank you for having us, and welcome to Lake Nona, one of our Tavistock signature projects. I hope while you're here you'll enjoy our restaurants and some nightlife in the town center, and just appreciate some of the things that we've done to sort of change development practices here, and we're advancing our agenda in Sunbridge. I do want to point out something very important, and they say stereotypes aren't true, but the two people in the room wearing sport coats are the land developer and the home builder. With the exception of sort of a dean and one or two others, but we had to put on our uniforms today. What I want to do, I'm going to frame today's session a bit. We're going to address this shifting to a more sustainable landscape. First of all, I'm going to address why we shift, why we had to shift in Sunbridge, and why we're doing it, and when the decisions are made. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of a high-level approach of how a master plan community developer works with 25,000 acres. And then we're going to address further down the panel, how is it executed? Greg Witherspoon and Matt McDermott are going to get into the details of Pierce's goals. How are we executing those on Sunbridge? And then, of course, who's affected? Our customer is Chris Wren. He buys lots from us and is one of several home builders that does that, but we have a customer. So we have a business relationship that we need to incorporate into these decisions about what to do about landscape. And then I'm going to come back and address what does it mean in terms of community governments. People often ask, well, okay, they're great, they're installed, but how is it maintained when the developer's gone and everybody's gone and the homeowners are there? How is it sustained over time? So I'm going to talk a bit about that. You got here today, so you know where Sunbridge is, close to Lake Nona and Orlando International Airport. It's a 24,000 acre master plan. It's got portions of it in Orange County. You're actually going to go visit the embryonic stage of the project in Osceola County. It is another, live, work, play, learn, teach community with heavy emphasis on connection to the natural ecosystem. A whole wide range of neighborhood types and employment centers. You're just going to see the very first stages of the first residential community, but you're going to see how we're executing on this sustainable landscape approach. And we have a philosophy rooted in responsible, sustainable development, and conservation obviously playing a major role. Pierce asked me to put this chronology together because I want to talk about when decisions are made. So in 2010, and actually probably 2 or 3 or 4 years ahead of that, Osceola County was developing their policies for this area, this 24,000 acre or 19,000 acre area. And so before we ever got involved, the county had spent a lot of time thinking about what this project should and should not be. The landowner, SLR, FRI, are components of the Mormon Church. They're the largest landowner in Central Florida, and we started an engagement of discussions with them on becoming their master developer, and it took us all of 2 years to negotiate that agreement. And it was rather lengthy. It's the most complicated agreement I've ever worked on in my career, and you can tell by my head and how I look, I've been around a long time. We didn't get our first initial approvals till 2017 or 18. And then we got some. You can see how we've been advancing some of this the project. But you can see how long it takes when you're dealing with such a large landholding. It is not something that happens overnight, and there's a lot of effort that goes into it. And so, how would a master plan community developer approach 24,000 acres? And this is just one of the tools that we would use. We started in 2013 trying to figure out, what are we going to do with this land? And so we go through this quantitative analysis of examining on 5-year increments, what's the infrastructure situation? What's the political regulatory environment? And if you don't think that developers think like that, we absolutely do. We have to understand what the politics of a community is before we can advance a development concept. And so you've all been or seen hearings where there's major conflict between land development proposals and the community. in our business, we want to resolve that way on the front end. We want to understand what the adopted policies are of the community, and we want to make sure that we can deliver on those policies as best as possible. We do an environmental assessment and, of course, market trends and demands. What are the development opportunities? And so that's the quantitative side. The qualitative side, we look at all the different real estate sectors and try to figure out what's really going to work here and what isn't going to work here. And so this, as we were negotiating our agreement with the landowner over that 2 years, we're going through this analysis, and it is extensive for such a large project. And it winds up in we use a lot of tools, a lot of GIS-based tools. This is back from 2014. This is so antiquated, it's not even used anymore. It's a really old tool. They're much more sophisticated tools. But in order for us to understand and make a deal with the landowner, we go through all of this analysis, all this due diligence. And of course, one of the issues that comes up, and did come up in our analysis of this project, was where's the water supply coming from? And that was a real issue. We were having these discussions right when the Central Florida Water Initiative was really in the throes of regional debate about where water supply is coming from and how it's going to be provided, who's going to pay for it. And so we knew from day one we had issues with regard to the lack of utility infrastructure in the area and a lack of water supply. And wastewater was a big, there was no wastewater treatment capacity and no plant, and we subsequently have designed and built our own plant. But no wastewater plant, no effluent, no reclaimed water, nothing to use for irrigation. So we had this real conundrum of water supply for this project. And we ultimately have entered into an agreement with TOA Water Authority, and we've sort of solved the capital project, but we still understand that we are operating in a resource-constrained environment, and we had to do something about water. And so that was in 2013, 2015 timeframe. So when is the decision made to shift? Now, you've all driven roads and seen these zoning signs, and by the time you see this zoning sign on a field, in the work that we do, the decision of what direction we're going has long since been made. And I'm gonna show you that in this graphic here. So what Pierce described in his pictures is really the land development process. It's the mass grading and the implementation of the stormwater plan and putting in the master infrastructure and all the work that goes into it, finally leading up to landscaping. But we're a real estate developer, and that part of the project, the land development component, comes much later. We have a whole process of pursuit, due diligence, pre-development, pre-construction, construction, open and operate. And so that land development piece, the pictures that Pierce showed you of the mass grading and the stormwater, comes in the fifth stage of what we do. The decisions have long since been made about what the landscape's going to look like and what the landscape budget's going to be and what your water supply is. All of that's been made. So if you are driving down the road and see a zoning sign, or you see big mass grading equipment, and you want to call your city council member or county commissioner and say, hey, we want a sustainable landscape there, it's probably too late. Those decisions have been made. And you can see, again, the details of the project design, and my colleague here, Jeff Thompson, can tell you that he's involved in every step of the process, and he will tell you that these decisions are constantly being evaluated. He's responsible for delivering landscape, hardscape, and irrigation budgets, not only the design, but the budgets, and those all have to be established in the final pro forma. And so decisions of financial decisions and policy decisions from a master developer are made earlier in the process than you think. And it's way before you start seeing activity on the site. So those of you that are going to be in the field, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. We have a whole overall approach to sustainability in Sunbridge. I'm going to focus on this tomorrow in the field. I'm going to be at one of the stations. We'll do a deeper dive on this. I'm not going to take your time this afternoon to do that, but needless to say, sustainable landscapes is just one component of an overall sustainability strategy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the guys that are really responsible for making it happen, which are the landscape architect, and Greg, it's all yours.
Thanks, Richard. So I have the pleasure of bringing all this stuff to life, right? And when we say bring it to life, it's not just plants, it's not just water, it's bugs, birds, it's everything. What we do as landscape architects really drive what happens on the ground. And sometimes it can be frustrating working in the builder-developer world, but sometimes it can be a real pleasure. And working with the folks at Tavistock and Sunbridge, it has been that because of this shift in paradigm. I'm going to go through the process a little bit and talk about a couple of key decision points and a couple of points in the process where decisions have to be made on the design side as well. So in brief, you've got to define the scope. I'll go into a little bit about what creating the plans mean and what the difference is between a development plan versus what we call an enhanced plan. And I'll really hit a little bit upon how what Richard was just describing influenced what we do as landscape architects in creating these plans. So, what's the scope? First step, what you see here is an actual diagram that we sat down with the folks at Tavistock and said, these are the elements that we are going to design as part of this project. This project in particular was Neighborhood D Phase 1. Some of the stuff we're going to be looking at tomorrow is actually Neighborhood C. So that was done prior to our engagement with a different design firm. But this is what it looks like. Streetscapes, open spaces, parks, the light green are some of the park opportunities, and then the streetscapes are included because those are part of the required process with the jurisdiction that we're working in. In this case, it's Osceola County. As part of that, we outlined what the deliverables were, and in this case, we were hired for two things. We were hired to do the development submittals and then the construction documents, and I'll get into kind of the difference of that in a little bit. Some of you in the audience may have heard of a thing called a code minimum plan. Well, that's typically what is with a development submittal. However, in today's world, one could argue the idea of a code minimum plan is really kind of going out the door because you've got to be able to do water calculations, budget submittals, detailed analysis in terms of shade and irrigation and other things like that I'll show you as part of the process. And we talked a little bit about supplemental services. So this was not part of this initial contract. Again, I'm with Kane & Associates. We are planners, landscape architects, and designers. But we did mention a little bit about the fact that, hey, there's a missing piece here. We may need to think about the homes as well. But this first contract for Neighborhood D and into the development submittals did not require that. And so we were focused on the open spaces, streetscapes, and things of that nature. As we got started, we wanted to talk a lot about design goals with this project because Sunbridge had been going on for a long time. We had, the Sunbridge sustainability goals in place. There were a lot of other influences. I mentioned that some of the early design work had already been completed. You see a nice graphic there, the Cyril's Drive plant palette. Really influential in terms of moving into Neighborhood D in terms of what we decided was the right plant mix to use. You also had Toho Water Authority standards, and those are kind of a moving target because they're becoming more and more restrictive in terms of just blatant overuse and over-fertilization and things of that nature. And we wanted to try to get ahead of that a little bit as we started looking at the landscape with Neighborhood D. And then additionally, there was the work that the Outside Collaborative is doing, right? Matt and I attended the session in 2021 together and got to tour what Cherry Lake was doing. And it's very influential. And it's the opportunity to really open some folks' eyes and say, wow, this is beautiful. This isn't just native for the sake of being native. This is a new aesthetic that we could employ and potentially even market that, right? So we can market the aesthetics, but we could also market the fact that, hey, this is a no-mo community. Guess what? It's going to be quieter. It's going to be less polluted. It's going to have a lot of benefits. And there's a marketing story there that the developer team can utilize and has. And then we get into the fun stuff. I think Richard said how those budgets are established very early on in the process. We look at those again when it's time for us to do our work as well. And of course, we've got to tie it all to a schedule. A large master plan community like Sunbridge and any other that you're working on, the schedule is really critical in terms of when these things are delivered and how they can get their certificates of occupancy and things of that nature. So the next step is the fun step, in my opinion. This is where us as designers get to just like go into our own little world. We have a little charrette internally. We pull out the pens and pencils. We really sit down and we think about what it means and what all of those objectives and how we can meet those and create something that's really experiential, beautiful, and meets all those goals. So these are a couple of the schematic plan deliverables that we created. The one on the right, this is a diagram of the street tree species planning. So we didn't want to just go completely random. We wanted a little bit of order to it, and that's kind of what that diagram illustrates. It is all native plant materials. There's a really great plant palette that you guys will see tomorrow. And then on the left, this is some of the vision plan that we came up with, some precedent images, and then some of the initial plans that we came up with on how to handle some of the park spaces. Next came the submittal plans. The key point in the submittal plans is that we got to take all the pretty picture that we were working on and all these great thoughts that we're doing, and we've got to narrow it down into a plan that makes sense. And it has to make sense from a number of ways. First one is it has to be coordinated with the civil engineering. What this plan doesn't show, because it's a little bit washed out, this is actually one sheet of this plan set. I brought a couple of visuals with me. The plan set on the chair that I left is this actual submittal. It's somewhere around 40 pages for landscape, hardscape, and irrigation plans. That was included as part of the civil engineering package, which is a plan set of upward of 150 sheets. So when Richard says, hey, you see the heavy equipment out there moving dirt, that's a result of Osceola County approving that plan based on those 150 sheets, and I think probably 7 or 8 additional reports that are all like this thick. But this is one sheet out of the landscape and irrigation plan, and I apologize it's washed out, but what you don't see is underlaid under here is the myriad of utilities. There's sewer, there's water, there's reclaimed water, there's electric setbacks, there's all of these other things, and that's really important because you've got to meet the code requirements associated with streetscapes, buffers, trees, all of those things. These are just some of the calculations. We have to do calculations on spacing of the trees, the size of the trees, how much shade mature trees are going to provide, and then, of course, the irrigation use, Toho efficiency program. You can't have more than 60% of your area cannot use high spray irrigation, if you will, so turf, the euphemism for turf. And then there's other things as well. There's offsets from utilities. You can see the canopy requirement. But interestingly enough, in Osceola, there is no residential requirement. So Osceola County does not have a single-family residential landscape requirement. Again, not included as part of this planning process, but we'll get into the effects of Toho Water Authority in just a moment. So the result. The one on the left, this is a sample from one of those plans that was in the original submittal documents. Started off going to the initial agencies in this case, but that's what the plan looked like. And you can kind of see here that in this streetscape zone, there's nothing addressed except for the trees. And so in our plans associated with the location directly in front of residential houses, all we have are trees, and that's meeting the county requirement. So this is an inflection point. So for us as designers, understanding what happens in that zone between the sidewalk and the curb, this is a detailed discussion with the developer at this point. So while this is going through all sorts of authority reviews and team reviews, we're working on finalizing the details with our clients. And so that includes a lot of specifications for all of the shrubs, the layout, the hardscape. Budgeting, of course, always comes back up. And the result of the discussion with our client, our great client Tavistock here, is that these spaces now in between the curb and the sidewalk don't have turf. So we have now gone to a condition where all of the open spaces in between the sidewalk, let me rephrase that, all the spaces in between the sidewalk and the curb that are directly adjacent to open spaces, which are areas that the client is going to have to manage, are now moving away from turf. And so in this case, we've gone to, I believe it's perennial peanut and some frog fruit, but we've got a palette that we're utilizing throughout the development. Just to note, things like this hardscape that we initially submitted has changed substantially. So those are the kind of things that we finalize in between what was the original submittal plan and then what we call the enhanced plan. And then we get to the fact with Sunbridge that we're missing the last piece of the puzzle, and that's the residential landscapes, right? And if you go back to look at this overall landscape and you think back to that diagram I was showing you, the relatively small amount of the colored space versus all of that area associated with the home landscapes, it's a big percentage. And Sunbridge recognized that, and along with what was required from the TWA, from the Toho Water Authority, there is a Toho efficiency program that regulates not only the water requirements inside the home, but also outside the home. So there's a full process of establishing affidavits and water budgets and all of those kind of things that go into a residential design in Osceola County that is under the Toho Water Authority jurisdiction. So we decided to come up with a set of landscape standards, community landscape standards. And Sunbridge made an investment in that. We were fortunate enough as Kane & Associates to be hired to help them bring this vision to life. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to match the landscape goals that we created with the residential landscape. And so along with the rest of the outside team, we actually got together as a group and came up with some ideas on how to utilize these native plants in the landscape. And you can see that there's no turf in either of these plans here. And then what you're seeing on the right, and I brought a copy of this document with me as well if somebody wants to flip through it, what you're seeing on the right is an actual plan in the guidelines. And so I want to highlight one thing here is that there's a 75% minimum native plant requirement. So as the developer, they're now using this tool to give to all of their builder clients and the residents. So they will all be looking at this document when they're doing their landscape or redoing their landscape. And we also have a maximum turf requirement. So we went down to 25% of your area can be turf, and that's it. So that's a significant change, and this is very impactful in terms of the amount of landscape that's out there at Sunbridge right now. So I went ahead and put together a little bit of a timeline as well. I just wanted to show you that the initial plans before we got involved were submitted back in September of 21, but then in that same month is when they issued a request for proposals, formal process by which they chose us. We were fortunate in a competitive situation to become the designer in Neighborhood D. And at that same time, they were already completing some of the landscape in Neighborhood C. So this is an evolutionary process where these are going in sequence on down the line. And then the Outside Collaborative 2021 happened, and at that point, we were awarded the contract, and shortly thereafter, we held an internal workshop with the other collaborators, Dix Hike, Cherry Lake, University of Florida, obviously, and some other folks all got together to talk about what we could do to change the paradigm with the residential landscapes. So from there, we basically finished up what we were doing in terms of Neighborhood D in 2022, and you can see just last month we actually completed the 100% documents for Neighborhood D, and in June of last year we completed the community landscape standards, and then here we are today, and you guys are going to get to see some of this work on the initial models. You can't see anything on Neighborhood D yet. It's still with those big machines moving dirt around, but you'll see some of the inspiration in the Neighborhood C landscapes as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
All right, so I came into this at November 2019 at the outside. I went to outside, and then we had this standards workshop in November last year. So at that point, the Sunbridge sustainability goals are established kind of big picture, but now we've got to drill down and actually start implementing these goals. Like Greg said, the Westland Park Neighborhood C design was already done, so they followed those big goals, but not fully thought out through this process that I'll go through. And then the landscape standards book is residentially, we wanted to develop residential standards as we have in Laureate Park, and we got to expand on that. The book Greg has there is about 3 times the size of the one in Laureate Park. Just very simple standards for Laureate Park, so we went much more into it to get into much more detail. So you'll see this tomorrow. This is in the yurts down at base camp, but these are the Sunbridge goals that Richard and Greg both talked about. Water conservation, ecological preservation. We know we want to do those. So in Neighborhood C, we knew we wanted to use native trees and shrubs, but no one was really discussing turf, sod, ground covers. That discussion hadn't even started. We hadn't thought about that yet. So the graphic here, this is the entrance statement. Fairly typical neighborhood entrance. There's a sign in the middle, enhanced landscape around it, St. Augustine sod all throughout. There's also large open spaces, which are also St. Augustine, which heavily watered. And then Tavistock and Sunbridge both work on large tree relocations to preserve, not heritage trees, but what we call heritage trees, large old oaks that we determine that are healthy enough to move and a process to move them. And then, like I said, conventional sod. So this is, the drawings are done. The landscape contract install is executed in December, and it starts in January of this year. So we're just getting started, and so this is a conventional neighborhood that we're trying to change. We started doing different trials. Life Soils had been a partner for a while. So on Cyril's Road that you'll see tomorrow, phase 2 is what we called, is what will get you from base camp to the neighborhood. We put Life Soils in the entire development of that road, being like he talked about, it's moonscaped, there's nothing there. The soils are from 30 feet underground, there's no nutrients, no organics. So we brought that into it. And that's been very successful, and you can visually tell, and then we have students researching it at the trial gardens. Yeah, okay, I'm on the right place, sorry. So that's the trial garden you'll see tomorrow over there, and how it's kind of split out. There aren't markers in the field, so you might want to take a picture of that while we're walking around tomorrow, but you can see the different treatments they have, whether they're with compost or without compost, and then how we irrigate them, if they're on a regular schedule or an as-needed schedule. So you'll hear more about that this afternoon and see it tomorrow. Me being in the field, I'm much more of a visual guy. You can tell. It's very easy to tell what has this Life Soils, and that's why it's become a standard now. Neighborhood C Phase 2, which is under construction, you'll see that. Life Soils is going in the entire development, and it'll be a standard practice moving forward. So I became part of the group, the outside group, and we're working on the residential standards. Our residential team wanted standards. These guys wanted to help out and really get into that discussion on how to really identify the residential standards. Like Greg talked about, there's community standards, there's commercial standards, but what do we do at the homes? And how to reduce water use there, how to get native plants in there. So it started with nurseries, Cherry Lake, Green Isle Gardens, landscape architects, and then the developer, all getting together, determining what our goals are and how to do this. Like I said, we started in November and we published in June. We focus on residential design. The plant palette was a big one. Neighborhood C, like I said, had started it. Cherry Lake, Dix Height, Canaan, they all offered comments, suggestions based on what we're growing, what's available here, how they do, because what grows well in Cherry Lake might not grow well down here, thus the trial gardens. So that plant palette will constantly evolve, as will this whole book, on what the results are. So if we're finding plants aren't doing well, we'll take them off the list. If they're doing great, we'll add them to the list. We'll try some things that aren't on the list. Drainage is also a big thing. Down here we have lots of water, as everybody can tell from the storm, and it's still taking its time. But residentially, these homes are on very small lots, somewhat close to each other, so how how to keep that drainage going so that you have a good environment for your landscape to grow. Irrigation we got into as well. Hadn't done that before, but working on smart controllers that are connected to the internet somehow, or a weather station so it only irrigates as needed. Using low volume irrigation in order to preserve that water on the home scale. And then some hardscape standards too, fairly typical, but permeable pavers, areas that aren't just going to shed water. So the first thing this group did is because, this is November, the community started being installed landscape in January, and right behind that were the model homes for the first neighborhood. So the first thing that the outside group needed to do was show these residential builders what's coming. And we thought the best and quickest way to do that is to create the concepts ourselves by having Canaan and Dix Height do layout, screening, use areas to determine what a typical home here in Sunbridge will look like. So we got together, they did that, we all reviewed it, and then we gave it to Cherry Lake and Green Isle Garden, where they started speccing the specific plants on what they had, what was growing, what was native, what was pollinator, how to mix them, and sourcing them and then giving prices for us. One of the big things I'm sure Chris will talk about is the price of any change. So one thing we were definitely looking for is to keep this design fairly cost neutral from a conventional landscape versus a native landscape. So pricing was always on our mind about how to do this as to get the builders on board easier. If it was a much more expensive thing to do, they'd probably fight more and we wouldn't get very far. So we gave them that, and you'll see tomorrow there's 10 or 12 of these model homes that are now installed, so you'll get to see all the typicals that are in the standards book. These model home became the typicals that you'll see in the standards book. They changed the title on it. Just some things that we've learned, because this has been a fairly quick process. Richard had several years to do this. We haven't been in the field for a year yet. So one of the big things we learned on the model homes in these typical landscapes was the quantity of material available. It's nice to have native landscapes. There's some nurseries doing it, but on a large scale, that is going to be a problem that we have and something that we need to overcome, and this group brings all those people together. Plant spacing. The native plants, we understand they're going to get bigger, they're going to grow wider, but in the nursery condition, when you first plant them, they're quite small. So that instant impact is not there, and the day one look that a model home needs and expects is something that we learned we need to adjust on. We need to do a little bit more on these model homes to have the bigger impact, or plant earlier, one or the other. So we need to work on that. And then with the model homes, not having turf in your yard, you have more space to do other activation, whether it's a fireplace, a playground, somewhere to play, other things to do with your backyards other than turf it, because a big mulch backyard didn't make much sense. And then once we got into it more, we designed the model homes and the typical landscapes, and that was sidewalk to the house and the backyard. We weren't talking about that buffer zone between sidewalk and curb. That is the homeowner responsibility, but it's still kind of a common space. It's one of those gray areas. So during this 6 months, we've really learned that we have a no-mow residential landscape, but yet we're throwing sod down and expecting them to maintain it. So you'll see this tomorrow on a couple of the homes. 3 of the homes out of 8, I believe, are done. But we've taken that turf back up on the model homes and planted ground covers. We have frog fruit, perennial peanut, and mimosa on the 3 lots. So this is another trial that we're doing to see how they stand up to, there's parallel parking here on the side, so how well do they do with traffic? Once residents move in, are the dogs taken over? And how those sustain. So this is another learning example that we'll take forward with us and implement. As Greg said, in neighborhood D will be fully implemented. Here it's a trial. Irrigation, as Greg said, we can't have irrigated sod in the backyard. There could be Bahia, but we were trying to go for no mow. So none of our model homes have sod in the backyard. And then the water budget calculator. That's not residentially needed, but it is a big factor on what we have to consider at the larger community scale. And then the boundary plantings you'll see tomorrow at base camp. We've learned a lot of stuff there. I know they're going to talk about it this afternoon, so I won't really get into it. But you can visually see the results. We have great research results. We learned what the deers like to eat and, and what they don't, so that automatically changed the plant list real quick. It was planted in January, and it was late January, early February. We did have a frost, so we got to learn real quick what plants did well in the frost, what died, what got damaged. I really like how the blueberries and firebush came out, but that's an aesthetic option. And then when you walk out there, how much flowering there is and how many pollinators are in. And then the last thing is, now that we do have some non-model homes going in, we've got a townhome that just got completed. We do have our first residence down there, is how do we control that new standard of installation? How do we maintain it with the homeowners? How do we educate the builders and homeowners? So all of these things we're continuing to learn. Like I said, it hasn't even been a year. The plant palette, the standards book, those will all get updated as we progress. And then be part of the builder turnovers for these future neighborhoods, so that we can all plan together moving forward. And with that, I've got my timeline too. It's pretty kind of like Greg's, doing this for a little less than a year. Last year's outside was in October, and then we got together in November to say, hey, we need standards here, both commercially and residentially, which ended up in the book. The ground covers were just planted at the end of August. I think they were planted really well. We had nice, good, mature material. They were planted tight spacing. So I think the initial results out of that are very promising on what that's going to look like and how it grows in. So that's a big thing on my timeline. And with that, it's Chris's turn.
Thank you very much, everybody, for having me here today. Here representing the big bad builder perspective on all of this. I couldn't hear everything that went into the presentations, but just, I went to UF, I wrote my thesis on sustainable community design. I have a pretty good grasp of the concepts that are being discussed here and how important it is to us moving forward in the state for existing residents, future residents from here and elsewhere. Real quick, I mentioned just since we're here in Lake Nona in this beautiful facility, probably my biggest claim to fame as a professional, as a consultant, was back in the mid-2000s, working with Jim Zaboral. He called me at 5 o'clock one day and said, hey, I need a 50-acre parcel carved out. And I said, what shape, what size, and he's like, it doesn't really matter, it just needs to be 50 acres. That was the 50-acre parcel that turned into the Sanford Burnham Institute. And as you see, has ultimately helped all of this kind of move forward. So my goal today is just to give you guys some insight into kind of my role and how it feeds into what is ultimately the finished product that you see. So I'm the director of forward planning. Forward planning is really entitlements manager in most instances. So I manage project-related due diligence. I manage the entitlement process, including the engineering and the environmental permitting. Responsible for creating project budgets to help our acquisitions team go through underwriting so we can kind of carve that into what a final sales price would be. So provide a lot of support to our acquisitions team, our development team, our permitting team, sales, marketing, and procurement, also construction, HOA, and finance. I find my job very engaging. There's a lot of departments that are involved, a lot of different mindsets, and we'll get to that. And then just keep the division updated on code changes, impact fee changes, political issues, moratoriums, et cetera. So for due diligence for us, and this is a typical project. Westland Park, for instance, we're buying finished lots from Tavistock, and so most of this is their headache. But we collect, review, and interpolate survey information, geotechnical data, environmental site assessments, ecological studies, local code requirements such as the TWA, TEP program, NEP or PSP requirements, evaluate concurrency capacity matters. Is there capacity in the schools? Is there capacity on the roads? Is there capacity in the utility system? Typically we're responsible for creating the site plan, the theming of the project, entry features, amenities, what's the amenity program going to be like, where is it going to be? Evaluate political environmental risk for the division. Is this worth our time? Do we need to wait? Do we need to push it? We have projects right now we're trying to push through before a county commission turns over because we know they're favorable, for instance. And then any contractual requirements that may exist between us and the seller, such as landscape requirements. So we do a lot of support, as I said, acquisitions, development costs, schedule for lot delivery. Where this comes in is just the cost of the landscape material. What's the additional cost associated with what is being installed at Westland, and how does that get into our underwriting, and trying to get that information in as early as we can so what we're providing to corporate for approval is as accurate as possible. Support for our procurement department, which is identifying any kind of unusual landscape irrigation requirements. We work in over 30 different municipalities, so you have a lot of different requirements to comply with. And then also to prepare the model center landscape plans for contracting, which to me it's a lot more involving than you might think, and that's part of this story. And then with our sales department, just informing them of any unique features of the community, such as native landscaping being required on all of the lots. All of this is summarized in what we call a summit, where we bring all the departments together, and my department, the entitlements department, plays a significant role in that, just trying to educate everybody in the division who's going to be working on this project as to what it entails. On the implementation side, we, again, collect landscape requirements, provide them, work with procurement, get those hopefully into the house costs, landscape plans, and just some of the process. So, and I'll show you some illustrations in a moment, but, we collect the information, we work with a landscape architect, we get a model center landscape plan created, we go to procurement gets it bid out with a landscape contractor, we look at those costs, we take those back to sales, everybody's got to understand what's going on, and, but at the end of the day, it leaves my hands and it goes to the procurement team, and they work with a landscape contractor. They come up with exhibits that they can bid off of. And then beyond that, it goes to the superintendent who installs it in the field. And the superintendent, just frankly, they're focused on getting the house closed, getting their certificate of occupancy. It's been a really challenging market delivering houses in a timely fashion. So there's just an extra emphasis on that. And in this instance, we had some challenges getting our models completed and CO'd in time for a big event that was planned for Westland Park, but it all worked out. So just the illustrations I spoke to. On the left-hand side is the exhibits that were sent to us by the developer. I was asked to take that and work with who is our typical LA and try and convert that into a normal model center landscape plan. Kind of put the whole story together, looking back to June and how this all ended up like it was. I was taking so long with the landscape architect getting that done that procurement ended up taking the exhibit that we were provided by the developer and got that bid out. So then we take that to sales and we show them, and on the right-hand side is what ultimately got installed for the certificate of occupancy. Now, it's not what's there today, it's not what you're going to see tomorrow, but on your left, you can see that there's pavers and there's rocks and stuff like that are shown in the side yards, and ultimately, we don't build that. We don't do that. There's too much liability associated with that. It's an impermanent solution. It takes a lot of maintenance. So we don't offer that. So sales is like, oh, we can't show that on the models. You got to take that out of there. And we were pushing so hard to get our COs that, they call me and they're like, what do we do? What do we do? I'm like, just put down sod for now so that everything's stabilized. You get your certificate of occupancy. We pull the sod up and then we replant it with material. And that's what happened. But what you see there is ultimately what was the final bid before we came in and retrofit. So that's kind of how the story went. So here are just some pics of what's actually in the field today that you will see. On your right, on your left is looking to what that large lawn panel was that was on the side that was originally shown as hardscape materials. On your right is the front of the house. These are our two models here, lots 23 and 24. We also have some homes on lots 44 through 46 that are about to close. Here's some other pictures. These are from last week, so this is about 4 months growth So this is the rear of the units, the side yard of the units, so you can just kind of see at 4 months growth what this looks like. And I will just say, like, landscape standards like this, in my opinion, they work better in a community like Westland Park. That's a traditional neighborhood design, community. You have a lot of rear-loaded product. There's not as much of a, I would think, expectation on the home buyer that they're going to have a useful yard for any purpose. So this is really the meat of it, and this is, this is my version of Wallace Stevens' 13 ways of looking at a blackbird. So this is our 8 ways of looking at a landscape plan. And again, this just highlights all the different departments that work in a home building environment and what their different concerns are, because everybody's goal is obviously build, sell homes, make our customers happy. So I'll just run through these real quick. I mean, sales, in their mind, like, well, is the customer going to like this? Are they not going to like this? Is this going to hurt us? Is somebody going to go to the community next door because they don't have native plants and they've got conventional landscape? Does this match our target consumer group? We have 12 different target consumer groups. So this is TCG 3. Is this what they want? Marketing, how do we present this? Is this a tool? Is this something that we can use to our advantage? I'm not giving you the answers to these questions. This is just for you to ponder. Procurement, what are the cost implications? Our procurement department's job is to control costs and know what they are, and know that they can get them in a timely fashion. That's really key to this. What's the time frame? What's the availability? Can our vendors provide it? We have our standard landscape contractors. Are they up to the task to install native plants? On construction, again, can we get this material in time? Can we get it installed? From the HOA, if this were a community where the HOA was managing the landscape, what are the costs for the management of the native landscape versus the conventional? How do you govern this through your covenants and deed restrictions? What happens if 3 out of 50 plants dies because the neighbor walks their dog by your house every day and it takes a break? Permitting, how do we demonstrate compliance? Again, we walked into this project thinking we were having to comply with the Toho Water Authority TEP requirements, and then as all of this was evolving, we adjusted. Land, which is me and my paranoid self, how do I make everybody understand this, and what disclosures may be required? What liability is out there? The first exhibits we got included some edible landscaping, and I'm thinking, oh goodness, what if somebody's kid eats blueberries and they're allergic? What does that do to us? What if the mulch washes out because it's not turf and it causes a trip hazard, for instance? But that's me. And then for the buyer, who's really that's who we're focused on, is their questions. Do they like this? How do they maintain it? How do they replace materials? If you get a letter from the HOA, hey, all your frog fruit's dead. Like, okay, well, where do I get frog fruit? I don't know. So those are just some of the thoughts. Again, no answers, just some questions for you guys to ponder. So appreciate your time. So.
I'm going to keep Chris's slide up here because this is really important. You've seen the sausage making, okay? 2015, we make a decision that we're operating in a resource-constrained environment. We don't have enough water. That's easy, and like Matt said, we had years with that decision. But getting it executed, I mean, if you see the detail that every one of these people go through, and ultimately at the end of the day, if Chris can't answer these questions positively, we're in the business to sell him lots. So he has to have a positive view of these questions, or he's not a buyer. And then we're in the business to, it's a profit-driven business. If we can't sell those lots because he can't successfully answer those questions, we've made a huge mistake. And we've sort of unveiled a little bit of the nonsense that we have gone through to get here. This has been fits and starts. This has not been easy. You might go out there and look at it in the ground and say, wow, that's great. You guys are doing great things. Thank you. But boy, what it took to get there and all the time and effort and energy. But at the end of the day, if Chris is not a buyer, we've made a huge mistake. And so Chris has been a buyer, And, we'll maybe get into this a little bit about what the reaction to the actual buyers have been to the landscape, because at the end of the day, he's got to sell homes, and the actual home buyers got to think positively about the end result. Chris, I'm going to just summarize a little bit on governance, because Chris raised the question of how is all of this maintained, and just sort of very quickly, he referenced CC&Rs, but we establish a contractual relationship with the developer when we sell them lots with the home builder. We sell home builder lots. There are contractual obligations to comply with certain conditions in their contract, and the primary condition is to comply with the Sunbridge landscape standards, which you heard Greg how they came about, and Matt how he's executing on those. And so early on, initially, the landscape plans are approved by the developer. Matt reviews those plans and says, yes, it meets the landscape guidelines, or it doesn't. And ultimately, the plans get approved. They get installed by the home builder. And then the issue of how is this maintained over time? Because at some point, the developer, this is 24,000 acres, we're going to be here for a long, long time, but ultimately governing the community, it's going to fall into the hands of a homeowners association. And Chris raised this question. Some communities, the HOAs actually maintain the landscapes. And we had a long discussion about whether or not to do that here, and it was felt like we weren't ready to make that step yet, to have an HOA maintain typically they maintain the front yards. And we weren't ready to do that. So we're sort of approaching maintenance from a fairly conventional standpoint, which means that each individual homeowner is going to be responsible for maintaining it. But we have landscape standards to go by, and the homeowners association will be the enforcing entity to make sure that somebody just doesn't come in and rip out everything that's in the front yard and put down turf. And so we're probably going to learn a lot about how this is going to operate going forward, as we've learned every step of the way, making this shift from conventional to sustainable landscapes. We're going to learn a lot as well. So that's a little bit about governance, and I just want to kind of summarize again. We showed you the sausage making from the academic who, by the way, he undersells this. He really is the driving policy change agent in this effort. I can't give Pierce and his team and UF enough credit. If I told you how many times he called me and beat me up over the phone and was throwing things at me and would bother me day and night, he really did sort of push this and kept pushing and kept pushing. If you know Pierce, he's just going to keep pushing till he gets his way. And we had a lot of internal debate inside the company as to whether to do this or not, because it's much easier to do it conventionally. It's a lot easier to sell homes with the big, lawns and the big irrigation. And so Pierce, I give you a lot of credit for driving this train. But I think we answered the questions we came to address today, which is, why did we shift? We had a resource-constrained environment. I talked about when the decision was made. It was early on, before these guys start designing plans. We knew we had to do something different. How is it executed? I mean, Greg and Matt, I just can't, and the whole outside team, I can't even imagine how much effort and work. I know how much effort and work went into it, and all the work of our suppliers and Cherry Lake. You push, you probably were pushing him, who pushed me. I don't know, but you guys have really been the team that's executed on this. And again, who is it affected? Yes, it affects everybody, but at the end of the day, Chris is our customer, and we have to make sure he's happy. And so we talked about governance as well. So I think the questions we raised at the beginning of this session, I think we've generally addressed. I think now I'm going to turn it over to Pierce and let you sort of manage the Q&A session if we have any follow-up questions.